For over a decade, Microsoft ranked every single employee on a curve. It wasn't a vague, informal habit either. It was a formal, mandatory process, sometimes called stack ranking, sometimes called forced distribution, and the mechanics of it were exact. Within every team, at every review cycle, managers were required to sort their people into fixed performance categories, and the categories had to match a preset distribution no matter what the team's actual performance looked like that year. A set percentage of every team had to land in the top bucket. A set percentage had to land in the bottom bucket, often flagged as underperforming, sometimes marked for eventual exit, regardless of whether the team, taken as a whole, had an outstanding year or a rough one. If every single person on a 10-person team genuinely performed at a high level that cycle, the curve still forced someone on that team into the bottom category because the distribution wasn't measuring performance against an absolute standard. It was measuring performance relative to everyone else unlucky enough to be reviewed alongside you. The idea wasn't unique to Microsoft, and it wasn't invented out of nowhere. Forced distribution systems trace back most famously to Jack Welch's tenure running General Electric, starting in the 1980s, where Welch popularized what he called differentiation, sorting employees into top, middle, and bottom tiers, and systematically managing out the bottom group year after year. Welch argued the approach kept GE lean and competitive, forcing continuous improvement by removing consistently weak performers on a predictable schedule. Plenty of large companies copied the model through the 1990s and 2000s, convinced that Welch's version of brutal clarity about performance was a big part of what made GE, for a stretch, one of the most admired companies in the world. Microsoft adopted its own version of this system, and by most accounts kept it in place for roughly a decade, spanning a period when the company was simultaneously trying to compete with fast-moving rivals in mobile, search, and cloud computing. The system was meant to drive competitive excellence, sharpening individual performance by making clear, unambiguous distinctions between strong and weak contributors, and theoretically motivating everyone to work harder to avoid landing in the bottom bucket next cycle. A detailed 2012 Vanity Fair investigation by journalist Kurt Eichenwald, based on interviews with numerous current and former Microsoft employees, found something close to the opposite happening in practice, and it's one of the more thoroughly reported accounts of a well-intentioned performance system quietly corroding the culture around it from the inside. Employees stopped wanting to work on the same team as other strong performers because the math of a forced curve meant a stacked team of talented people still guaranteed someone talented would get ranked at the bottom purely by the arithmetic of the system, regardless of how well that person actually did their job. Being surrounded by excellence, which should intuitively be a good thing for anyone trying to grow and do great work, became a personal career risk instead. Ambitious employees reportedly began engineering their own team assignments, specifically to avoid working alongside Microsoft's most talented engineers, not because they disliked those colleagues, but because proximity to genuine excellence made a bad ranking for themselves statistically more likely under a system that only cared about relative position within whatever small group happened to be reviewed together. That single distortion cascaded into behavior that actively worked against collaboration, and Eichenwald's reporting captured it in specific, uncomfortable detail. People began sabotaging colleagues instead of collaborating with them, in ways ranging from subtle to blatant, because helping a teammate succeed could directly cost your own ranking within that same review cycle. Engineers described avoiding joint projects with Microsoft's most capable people, specifically to protect their own review scores, deliberately choosing collaborators who wouldn't outshine them, rather than collaborators who would produce the best possible product. Some employees reportedly withheld information from colleagues, delayed help on shared projects, or quietly declined to flag a teammate's good idea to leadership because a colleague's visible success came with a real, measurable cost to their own position on the curve. None of this required anyone to be a uniquely bad person. It required a system that made helping a colleague and protecting your own career genuinely, structurally opposed to each other, and then asked employees to somehow choose collaboration anyway against their own rational self-interest, cycle after cycle, year after year. Internal surveys cited in the Vanity Fair investigation, and corroborated by later reporting, found that employees viewed stack ranking as the single most destructive process operating inside the company. And that's a genuinely striking finding given everything else Microsoft was navigating during that stretch. Worse than any specific external competitor. Worse, in employees' own reported estimation, than losing high-profile deals to rivals like Apple or Google during a period when Microsoft was visibly losing ground in mobile and consumer markets it had once dominated. Employees weren't primarily worried about the external competitive threat. Many of them named an internal HR process as the bigger daily source of dysfunction, which tells you something about how deeply a badly designed internal system can outweigh even serious external pressure in shaping how people actually experience their jobs day to day. In 2013, incoming leadership scrapped the system entirely. Lisa Brummel, then Microsoft's head of human resources, led the change, replacing stack ranking with a system built around more frequent feedback, explicitly removing the forced curve and shifting formal evaluation criteria to emphasize teamwork and customer impact rather than pure relative individual output. The shift wasn't purely cosmetic language either. Employee sentiment around collaboration measurably improved within roughly 2 review cycles following the change, according to internal survey data Microsoft later referenced publicly, and it lined up with a broader cultural shift at the company over the following years under CEO Satya Nadella, who took over in 2014 and made collaborative, growth-oriented culture an explicit, repeated theme of his public leadership philosophy, frequently contrasting it against what he described as the more internally competitive culture of the preceding decade. Microsoft wasn't alone in this arc, and it's worth knowing that because it shows this wasn't one company's isolated HR mistake, it was a broader pattern across corporate America that eventually corrected itself almost everywhere at once. General Electric itself, the company that popularized the approach under Jack Welch, quietly moved away from strict forced ranking in the years following Welch's departure, as later leadership found the rigid distribution increasingly mismatched with how GE wanted to run performance management going forward. Yahoo faced significant internal and public backlash after implementing a stack ranking style system in 2012 to accompany layoffs, with employees and outside observers criticizing it as demoralizing and arbitrary. By the mid-2010s, a wave of large companies across tech and beyond, including Microsoft, GE, Accenture, and others, had either substantially softened or fully abandoned formal forced ranking systems, in what amounted to a fairly rapid, industry-wide reversal on a management fad that had dominated corporate performance reviews for the better part of 2 decades. It's worth walking through a handful of smaller, more everyday versions of this same failure mode, because most managers reading about Microsoft's stack ranking system will correctly conclude they'd never implement anything that extreme, while missing a milder version of exactly the same mechanism already running quietly inside their own team. Picture a sales team where bonus pool dollars are explicitly capped and split competitively among reps, meaning one rep's bigger bonus mathematically comes directly out of a colleague's smaller one, rather than each rep simply earning based on their own individual results against a fixed target. Reps in that structure have genuine, rational incentive to withhold useful sales tactics from each other, decline to mentor a newer teammate who might otherwise become a threat to their own position in the pool, or even quietly avoid referring a promising lead to a colleague who's clearly better positioned to close it, because a colleague's, when under a capped, shared pool is structurally a loss for everyone else competing for the same fixed dollars. Picture an engineering team where promotion slots are explicitly capped per cycle regardless of how many engineers on the team are genuinely operating at the next level's standard that year. Even without any formal stack ranking language anywhere in the company's official policies, engineers quickly figure out, informally and correctly, that a strong cycle for a teammate functionally reduces their own odds of getting the 1 or 2 available promotion slots that cycle, since the number of slots doesn't expand just because more people earned one. The natural response, entirely predictable and entirely rational given the constraint, is quiet reluctance to advocate loudly for a peer's promotion case, even when that peer's work genuinely merits it and the engineer privately knows it does. Picture a customer support team where individual agents are ranked weekly on a public leaderboard for ticket resolution speed, visible to the whole team in real time. Agents start avoiding the most complex, time-consuming tickets, the ones that genuinely need careful, unhurried attention, specifically because those tickets tank an individual's position on the leaderboard relative to colleagues quietly cherry-picking simple, fast tickets instead. Customers with the hardest, most important problems end up waiting longest for help, which is close to the exact opposite of what a good support team should optimize for, and it happens purely because the visible ranking rewarded speed relative to peers rather than resolution quality against an absolute bar. Picture a smaller professional services firm where annual bonuses are distributed from a single shared pool with a hard, unmovable ceiling, so that regardless of how well the firm as a whole performs in a given year, one associate's larger slice always means a colleague's slice gets correspondingly smaller. Associates in that structure develop a quiet, rational disincentive to help a struggling colleague catch up or to loop a peer into a promising new client relationship, because a rising colleague under a fixed, unmovable pool is a direct, mathematical threat to their own share of it, no matter how much genuine goodwill exists between them personally outside of bonus season. Notice the exact same structural signature running through every one of these examples, echoing precisely what happened at Microsoft and, decades earlier, at GE under the original Welch model. None of these systems technically forbid collaboration in their written policy. None of them explicitly reward sabotage or explicitly punish helping a colleague in any formal document an employee could point to. End quote. What they all quietly do instead is make one person's success mathematically, structurally connected to a colleague's failure, whether through a hard-capped bonus pool, a fixed number of promotion slots, or a formally forced ranking curve. Once that connection exists, self-interested behavior and team-sabotaging behavior become functionally identical from the individual's point of view, and asking people to consistently choose collaboration against their own measured self-interest, cycle after cycle, is asking for a level of pure selflessness that essentially no incentive system anywhere has ever reliably produced at scale, across a large group of ordinary people with ordinary careers and ordinary financial pressures to worry about. The common mistake here isn't wanting clear, rigorous performance standards, and it isn't wanting to identify and eventually address genuine underperformance on a team, both of which remain completely legitimate management goals that no company should abandon just because Microsoft's specific version of forced ranking went badly. The mistake is building the mechanism for identifying performance as a zero-sum comparison against immediate colleagues, rather than as a measurement against a clear, absolute, and genuinely achievable standard that has nothing to do with how anyone else on the team happens to be doing that particular quarter. A review system built around comparing employees against each other, instead of against a defined standard everyone could theoretically meet or exceed simultaneously, quietly rewards people for making colleagues look worse relative to themselves, not for doing genuinely better work in any absolute sense, because relative position is the only thing the system is actually measuring or rewarding at the end of the day. There's a diagnostic question worth running against your own team's current review process, regardless of whether it involves anything as formal as a forced curve. Take any two people on the team who are both performing well in a given cycle. Ask whether the review process, as actually structured, can genuinely reward both of them fully and simultaneously, or whether there's some hidden ceiling, a capped bucket of top ratings, a capped bonus pool, a capped number of promotion slots, that quietly forces one of their good years to come at the other's expense. If the honest answer involves any kind of cap that isn't tied to an absolute standard, you likely have a milder version of the exact dynamic that ran through Microsoft for a decade, just without anyone in the building calling it stack ranking out loud. The word for the system matters far less than the math underneath it, and the math is what employees respond to, whether or not HR ever uses the phrase forced distribution in an official policy document anyone actually reads. It's also worth noting what the fix specifically wasn't at Microsoft, because it's tempting to hear they got rid of forced ranking and assume the replacement was some kind of soft, standards-free system where everyone gets a good review regardless of performance. That's not what Brummel's changes did, and it's not what later reporting described. The company still identified genuine underperformance and still had real consequences for it. What changed was the mechanism generating that judgment. Instead of a mathematical requirement that some fixed percentage land at the bottom no matter what, managers evaluated people against defined expectations for their specific role, with underperformance identified because someone genuinely wasn't meeting a real bar, not because the curve required a scapegoat that cycle regardless of whether one existed. Rigor and forced relative comparison aren't the same thing, and it's entirely possible, as Microsoft's own subsequent decade suggests, to keep the former while dropping the latter. The fix Microsoft eventually landed on generalizes well beyond one company's specific 2013 policy change. Evaluate people against a real, absolute standard tied to their actual role and actual expected output, not against a forced distribution that mathematically requires some fixed percentage of any group to land at the bottom, regardless of how that group actually performed. Make collaboration and helping colleagues an explicit, visibly rewarded part of what gets evaluated and recognized, rather than something that competes directly against an employee's own individual metrics for a finite number of good outcomes. And treat a capped bonus pool, a hard limited number of promotion slots, or any other structurally zero-sum reward mechanism as a serious warning sign worth actively investigating, even when nothing in the company's official policy explicitly says employees are competing against each other for it, because the structure itself sends that message regardless of what the policy document claims. If your performance system pits your own people against each other for a fixed number of good scores, a fixed pool of bonus money, or a fixed number of promotion slots, you're not really measuring talent at all. No matter how rigorous and data-driven the system looks on a slide deck to leadership, you're quietly incentivizing people to work against the very team they're supposedly part of, and Microsoft spent roughly a decade finding out exactly how expensive that quiet incentive turns out to be once it fully embeds itself into daily behavior across an entire company. New videos on workplace psychology land here regularly, so stick around if this one hit close to home.